There are ways of being present in a city while simultaneously being completely unseen, not hidden exactly, not deliberately avoiding notice, but simply occupying space in a manner that registers to others as absence rather than presence, as obstacle to be navigated around rather than person to be acknowledged. The man sitting on the concrete steps outside Fletcher & Sons used books at the corner of 5th and Morrison had perfected this form of invisible occupation over the past 8 months, had learned through accumulated small rejections and avoidances that making himself small and still was the only way to exist in public space without triggering the discomfort or hostility that his more visible presence seemed to create. It was Thursday evening in late October, that transitional hour between legitimate day and established night when the city's character shifted from commercial to social, when the sidewalks that had been dominated by purposeful commuter traffic began to include people moving more leisurely toward restaurants and entertainment venues, when the quality of attention people brought to their surroundings changed from purely functional navigation to something that included at least marginal awareness of atmosphere and other people. The temperature had dropped to that borderline cool that made light jackets comfortable, the sky showing the particular orange-pink quality that urban sunsets create when filtered through building-reflected light and atmospheric particles. The bookstore behind the man had closed 2 hours earlier, 5:30 p.m., consistent with their weekday schedule, but its exterior steps provided seating that was technically public space, that allowed the man to occupy this location without technically trespassing, without giving police or property owners clear justification for removing him. He'd learned over months of navigating the city's complicated geography of acceptable homeless presence that certain locations tolerated sitting while others didn't, that bookstore steps were generally safer than bank entrances, that timing mattered as much as location, that being present during business hours created different responses than being present after businesses closed. He was 46 years old, though the past year had aged him in ways that probably made him appear older to casual observers. His name was David Chen, though that name had become increasingly abstract over months of not being addressed by it, of existing in contexts where names weren't exchanged or needed, of being referenced if at all by location or appearance rather than by identity, the guy who sits by the bookstore, or that Asian man who's always on 5th Street. His clothes were clean, he maintained hygiene as best he could given limited resources, used public restroom facilities when available, had learned which establishments would allow him to wash without purchasing anything and which required some minimal transaction to access their facilities. But the clothes showed their wear, showed the accumulated strain of being worn too frequently without adequate replacement, showed the particular kind of deterioration that comes from limited wardrobe options and constant use. His face held expression that people who study homelessness would recognize as characteristic of chronic displacement, a kind of deliberate neutrality, a studied absence of effect designed to minimize the emotional responses his presence might trigger in others. Not hostile, not overtly sad, just blank in ways that suggested he'd learned that displaying emotion created problems, that appearing too desperate invited pity that was often accompanied by contempt, that appearing too content invited resentment from people who felt he shouldn't be content in his circumstances. So he maintained careful neutrality, kept his gaze lowered toward the sidewalk, made himself as unobtrusive as possible while technically occupying public space. His position on the bookstore steps gave him view of the sidewalk traffic without requiring him to make eye contact with anyone passing, allowed him to observe the flow of people without engaging directly with them. He'd been sitting there for approximately 90 minutes, had arrived around 4:30 p.m. when the bookstore was still open but when foot traffic was light enough that his presence wouldn't interfere with customers entering or leaving. Would probably sit for another hour or two before moving to the shelter where he'd been sleeping most nights, before joining the line that formed around 8 p.m. for evening check-in, before navigating the shelter's complicated social dynamics and institutional procedures to secure bed for the night. The foot traffic at this hour was heavy, hundreds of people passing in both directions, most moving with purpose toward wherever their evening plans were taking them, few paying attention to the man on the bookstore steps beyond the minimal awareness required to avoid collision. He'd learned to read this traffic, to identify which people were likely to offer money or food, usually older people, usually women, usually those who made eye contact first before approaching, versus which people were likely to express hostility or call authorities, more varied demographic, but generally younger men who seemed to interpret his presence as implicit accusation or threat. Mostly people just passed. Didn't look directly at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, just navigated around him the way they'd navigate around any static obstacle in their path. This was preferable to negative attention, but it created its own form of psychological toll, the accumulated experience of being looked past, of being present but unregistered, of occupying space without mattering to anyone occupying that same space. After months of this, David had almost forgotten what it felt like to be actually seen, to be acknowledged as person rather than as feature of urban landscape. A woman in her mid-30s was walking quickly along the sidewalk, moving with the purposeful stride that suggested she was running slightly behind schedule, that she had somewhere to be and was calculating whether she could make it on time. She was dressed in business casual, nice jeans, blouse under light jacket, practical but stylish boots, and was holding the hand of a young boy who was having difficulty maintaining her pace, who kept falling slightly behind and forcing her to slow or to pull him forward with gentle but insistent tugs. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, wearing child-sized jacket and backpack that suggested he'd recently been picked up from after-school care or similar program, his face showing the kind of tired contentment that comes at the end of a long day of structured activities. His mother, David assumed it was his mother based on their physical interaction and the casual authority with which she was managing his movement, was checking her phone periodically while walking, was monitoring time or messages while simultaneously managing her son's progress along the crowded sidewalk. As they approached David's position on the bookstore steps, David looked up. He'd been staring at the sidewalk for the past hour, had been maintaining his usual posture of deliberate non-engagement, but something about the child's presence triggered automatic social response that he hadn't consciously decided to make. He looked at the approaching mother and child, and his face arranged itself into small smile, not elaborate expression, not anything that would seem presumptuous or threatening, just brief acknowledgement of their presence, small gesture of social participation that he hadn't quite lost the instinct for despite months of having that instinct consistently unrewarded or punished. The smile was careful. Almost uncertain. Carried awareness that smiling might be interpreted as inappropriate, that expressing friendliness from his position might be received as threatening or manipulative, that any emotional display from him could trigger defensive responses. But it was also genuine, wasn't calculated attempt to elicit charity or sympathy, wasn't performance designed to manipulate observers' emotions. Just automatic social behavior, brief moment of allowing his face to express something besides careful neutrality, small attempt to participate in the social world he'd been excluded from for months. The woman saw the smile. David registered her seeing it, saw her eyes move from her phone to his face, saw her expression shift from distracted preoccupation to something that might have been wariness or discomfort or just surprise at being smiled at by homeless man on bookstore steps. She didn't smile back. Instead, her grip on her son's hand tightened, her pace increased slightly, her body language communicating clear desire to move past this interaction without engagement, to get her son away from this person whose smile had registered as something concerning rather than friendly. This response was familiar to David. Had experienced it countless times, the way his attempts at normal social behavior were reinterpreted through lens of his circumstances, the way expressions that would be received as friendly or neutral from housed person were received as threatening or inappropriate from him. He felt the familiar shame and resignation that these moments created, felt his face falling back into neutral expression, felt himself retreating into the psychological space where he could exist without expecting anything from others. But the child stopped. Not dramatically, not with any particular intention, just stopped walking in the way children do when something catches their attention, when some aspect of their environment registers as worth attending to despite adult urgency to keep moving. His mother continued walking for half step before realizing he'd stopped, before being pulled backward by his hand, before turning with expression that showed frustration at the delay. "Eli, come on, we're late," she said, her tone carrying the slightly sharp quality that parents use when they're stressed and their children aren't cooperating with necessary schedules. But Eli wasn't moving. He was looking at David. Looking with the particular quality of attention that children bring to their observations, with the absence of social filtering that makes adults' attention more selective and judgmental. He'd seen David smile at him and his mother. And in Eli's understanding of the world, which was still relatively simple, still largely uncontaminated by the complex social hierarchies and prejudices that shape adult perception, someone smiling at you was something that required acknowledgement, was social overture that deserved response. David remained frozen, uncertain what was happening, uncertain whether the child's attention was going to create problems. uncertain whether the mother would interpret her son's interest as dangerous situation requiring protection. The moment extended beyond comfortable duration, became awkward, became something that needed to resolve somehow. Eli studied David's face. Not with fear, not with suspicion, just with open curiosity that children use when trying to understand something new. Then, slowly and deliberately, his face arranged itself into smile. Not polite social smile, not careful measured expression, but full open child smile that involved his entire face, that crinkled his eyes and showed his teeth and communicated uncomplicated positive response to the smile he'd received. The smile was pure in ways that adult smiles rarely are. Wasn't contaminated by calculation about what the smile might achieve, wasn't filtered through awareness of social hierarchies or judgments, wasn't performing anything except genuine response to perceived friendliness. Just simple reciprocal acknowledgement that someone had smiled at him and that smiling back was appropriate response. David felt something crack in his chest. Not tears, not laughter, but some emotional release that he hadn't experienced in months, some recognition that he'd been seen not as problem or obstacle or source of discomfort but as person offering simple friendly gesture that deserved friendly response. The feeling was overwhelming in its intensity, was disproportionate to the actual interaction, but that disproportion reflected months of accumulated invisibility and rejection that made even small acknowledgement feel significant. His posture changed. He sat slightly more upright, his shoulders coming back fractionally from their habitually slumped position. His face showed something besides careful neutrality, showed something that might have been surprise or gratitude or just relief at having successfully engaged in normal human interaction without that interaction being contaminated by others' discomfort with his circumstances. "Thank you," David said quietly, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Speaking to child he didn't know, thanking him for something that probably seemed trivial to the child but that felt genuinely significant to David. Thanking him for the brief moment of being treated as person rather than as problem. Eli's mother turned at this, her expression showing embarrassment and concern, embarrassment that her son had created this interaction, concern about what the homeless man might want or expect from her son's attention. She moved quickly to collect Eli, to pull him away from David's position, to resume their interrupted progress along the sidewalk. "I'm sorry," she said to David, though David wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Sorry that her son had stopped. Sorry that her son had smiled at him. Sorry that they'd acknowledged his existence briefly before returning to appropriate social distance. The apology felt worse than no interaction at all, felt like she was apologizing for her son's kindness, was treating his simple friendly response as mistake that required correction. "Come on, Eli," she said firmly, pulling him forward with hand that had never released his, resuming their walk with pace that suggested she wanted to put distance between them and the awkward interaction as quickly as possible. Eli looked back once as they walked away, his face showing confusion that suggested he didn't understand why his mother was upset, didn't understand what he'd done wrong by smiling at someone who'd smiled at him. But he didn't resist his mother's grip, just allowed himself to be pulled along, the interaction already becoming memory rather than present experience. David watched them disappear into the sidewalk crowd. The whole interaction had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Was already over. Was already being absorbed into the evening's flow of activities and people, was already becoming just another brief moment that would be forgotten by everyone except David himself. Except it wasn't forgotten by David. He remained sitting on the bookstore steps long after Eli and his mother had disappeared, long after the specific spot where they'd been standing had been occupied and vacated by dozens of other pedestrians, long after any rational person would have moved on to whatever came next in their evening. He remained there replaying the interaction, not just replaying the external facts of what had occurred but replaying the internal experience of it, the way it had felt to be smiled at without judgment, the way it had felt to have his gesture of friendliness reciprocated rather than rejected. David slept poorly that night in the shelter. Not because of the usual reasons, the noise, the crowded conditions, the institutional atmosphere, the awareness of living in proximity to many others experiencing similar circumstances, but because his mind kept returning to the afternoon's interaction, kept examining it from different angles, kept trying to understand what had shifted in him during that brief exchange. The smile itself wasn't the point. He'd been smiled at before, occasionally, usually by people offering charity or by social service workers attempting to establish rapport. Those smiles had been different, had been performances of friendliness designed to achieve particular effects, had carried underlying awareness of the power dynamics and social distance between smiler and recipient. Eli's smile had been different. Had been simple reciprocal response, had been uncontaminated by pity or calculation or any of the complex emotions that usually colored interactions between housed people and homeless people. The difference mattered in ways David struggled to articulate even to himself. It wasn't that Eli had treated him as equal. Child couldn't possibly understand the social hierarchies that made David's position marginal and stigmatized. It was that Eli had treated him as person, had responded to his smile as social gesture deserving response rather than as something concerning that required parental protection from. Had engaged with him for that brief moment without the filtering that adult awareness imposes, without the judgment and distance that characterized nearly all of David's interactions with the housed world. Over the following days, David found himself thinking repeatedly about the interaction. Found himself sitting on the bookstore steps at similar times, not consciously waiting for Eli and his mother to pass again but somehow hoping they might, hoping for another brief moment of that kind of uncomplicated acknowledgement. They didn't pass again, at least not that David noticed, though the evening sidewalk traffic was heavy enough that he might have missed them, might have been looking elsewhere during the brief window when they'd have been visible. But something about the interaction had shifted his internal state in ways that weren't immediately visible but that gradually accumulated into behavioral changes. He began making eye contact with people passing by, not aggressively or expectantly but just allowing himself to see them and potentially be seen by them rather than maintaining his previous strategy of careful invisibility. Most people still didn't respond, still looked past him or actively avoided his gaze, but occasionally someone would nod or briefly smile back, and those small acknowledgments felt more significant than they would have felt before. Eli's smile had reminded David what normal human interaction felt like. A week after the interaction, David shaved. He'd been maintaining basic hygiene throughout his months of homelessness, washing his face and hands regularly, keeping his clothes as clean as limited resources allowed, but he'd let his beard grow because shaving required resources and care that felt unnecessary given that no one was looking at him anyway. But after Eli's smile, the beard started to feel like part of his invisibility strategy, like way of making himself less distinct and noticeable, and maintaining that strategy started to feel like betraying the possibility that had been opened by being actually seen by someone. The shaving happened at the public library's restroom, using disposable razor he'd received in shelter hygiene kit, taking care despite limited facilities and inadequate mirror to achieve result that was at least passable, that made his face feel more like face rather than just collection of features being deliberately obscured. The shaving was small act, would be invisible to most people observing him, wouldn't change his material circumstances or improve his immediate prospects. But it represented shift in how he was relating to his own visibility, represented tentative embrace of being seen rather than retreating into deliberate absence. 2 weeks after the interaction, David inquired at the shelter about job placement services. The shelter offered basic employment assistance, help with resume preparation, information about temporary labor opportunities, connections to employers who sometimes hired from populations experiencing homelessness. David had avoided engaging with these services during his previous months at the shelter, partly because his depression and shame about his circumstances had made job seeking feel impossible, partly because looking for work required level of hope about future that he'd lost somewhere during the process of becoming homeless. But Eli's smile had cracked something in that resignation, had created opening where small hope could exist, had reminded him that being person rather than just homeless person was still possible if he could find ways to reconstruct the external markers that separated persons from homeless persons. Getting work would be difficult, he had employment gaps to explain, had limited recent references, had appearance and circumstances that made many employers immediately dismiss him as unsuitable. But difficulty was an impossibility, and the process of trying felt newly imaginable in ways it hadn't felt before the interaction. 3 weeks after the interaction, David attended job interview. The position was entry-level warehouse work, physically demanding, paying slightly above minimum wage, offering no benefits, the kind of work that housed people with options would generally avoid but that represented legitimate pathway out of homelessness for people willing to accept its terms. The interview went adequately though not exceptionally. David's months of minimal social interaction had degraded his professional communication skills. His nervousness about being judged made him somewhat stilted in his responses. His awareness that he desperately needed this job probably showed in ways that made him seem less desirable than applicants who had other options. But he'd shown up. Had filled out application. Had engaged with hiring managers' questions with honesty about his circumstances and with dignity about his capability despite those circumstances. Whether he'd get the position remained uncertain, would depend on how many other applicants there were, how much the employer valued his desperation to work versus valued other applicants' more conventional backgrounds. But the process of trying felt like rejecting the passivity that had characterized his previous months, felt like acting on the possibility that had been opened by being actually seen by 7-year-old who'd simply responded to smile with smile. David got the warehouse job. Started 3 weeks after the interview, working overnight shift that was least desirable and therefore most available to applicants with complicated backgrounds. The work was exactly as difficult as he'd expected, physically exhausting, repetitive, managed by supervisors who viewed workers as interchangeable units of labor rather than as individuals. But it provided income, provided structure, provided pathway out of shelter system into room rental situation that was marginal but was also his own space rather than shared institutional environment. The transition from homelessness to housing wasn't dramatic or complete. David spent 6 months working the warehouse job while living in single room with shared bathroom down the hall, accumulating enough stability and references to eventually find better position doing facilities maintenance at small office building, accumulating enough income to eventually afford 1-bedroom apartment in aging complex on city's outskirts. The process took years rather than months, involved setbacks and difficulties that aren't part of simple narrative about smile changing someone's life. But the process started with Eli's smile, or more accurately started with what Eli's smile had reminded David was possible, that being seen, being acknowledged, being treated as person rather than as problem was still available if he could find ways to move back toward the social world he'd become separated from. The smile hadn't solved his homelessness, hadn't addressed the systemic factors that had created his circumstances or the personal factors that had made him vulnerable to those systemic forces. It had just created brief moment of human connection that had reminded him he was human, that being human meant something, that the distance between his current circumstances and something resembling normal life wasn't absolutely unbridgeable. Eli, meanwhile, never remembered the specific interaction. Was 7 years old when it occurred, would have countless similar interactions with strangers during childhood, would have no particular reason to retain memory of brief moment when he'd smiled at homeless man on bookstore steps. When he was older, teenager, young adult, his mother occasionally told the story as example of his childhood innocence, framed it as moment when she'd learned that her son's unself-conscious kindness could create effects she hadn't anticipated. She told it with slight embarrassment about her own reaction, about having pulled him away, about having apologized for his attention, and with recognition that her instinct to protect him from interaction with homeless person had been exactly the kind of response that perpetuated the invisibility and marginalization that made homelessness so psychologically devastating. But Eli himself remembered it only vaguely if at all, was told by his mother that he'd done something kind but didn't have independent recollection of the event, couldn't picture the man's face or reconstruct the specific moment when simple smile had created effects that would ripple forward through years of consequences. The lack of memory wasn't failure, wasn't indication that the interaction hadn't mattered, was just normal operation of childhood memory that retains some experiences while letting others fade into general impression rather than specific recollection. David remembered everything. Remembered the exact location on the bookstore steps, the quality of evening light, the child's face as he'd turned back to smile, the feeling of being seen that had been so unexpected and so significant that it had become anchoring memory, reference point for future self when he needed reminder about what was possible, evidence that even brief moments of connection could create openings that hadn't existed before those moments occurred. 5 years after the interaction, David was living in modest apartment, working full-time job with benefits, maintaining connections with small number of friends he'd made through work and through slowly rebuilding social life. His circumstances were still marginal by middle-class standards, he had no savings to speak of, no career advancement prospects, no family connections that provided safety net, but he was housed, was employed, was participating in social world rather than existing on its margins. The transformation from his circumstances 5 years earlier was substantial, was the difference between homelessness and housed working poor life. When asked by coworkers or acquaintances about how he'd moved from homelessness to housing, when people learned about his history and expressed curiosity about his recovery process, David sometimes told story about the child who'd smiled at him. Told it not as magical transformation story but as story about small moment that had reminded him of possibility, that had created opening where motivation could exist, that had been catalyst for process that had involved years of work and countless small decisions rather than being immediate solution to his circumstances. People usually found the story touching but also somewhat unsatisfying. They wanted more dramatic narrative, wanted single moment that had changed everything, wanted clear causation between smile and recovery, wanted story where kindness had immediate and obvious effects rather than being one factor among many in complex process of rebuilding life. David understood their desire for that narrative but couldn't honestly provide it. The smile had mattered but it hadn't been sufficient by itself, had just been beginning rather than being complete explanation. David occasionally returned to the bookstore steps. Not to sit there, that would have felt like regression, like returning to circumstances he'd worked hard to escape, but to walk past, to observe the location where the interaction had occurred, to carry that memory forward as reminder about what had started there. The bookstore had changed ownership since then, had different name and slightly different inventory focus, but the steps remained essentially unchanged, still provided seating for people waiting for the store to open or for people using them as temporary rest during longer walks. Sometimes there were homeless people sitting on those steps. Sometimes the same careful invisibility that David had practiced, same strategy of making themselves small and unobtrusive, same expression of deliberate neutrality designed to minimize others' discomfort with their presence. David would usually acknowledge them, brief nod, sometimes small amount of money if he had cash available, occasionally brief conversation though he'd learned that many people in that situation didn't want extended interaction, didn't want to perform gratitude or explain their circumstances to strangers. The acknowledgements felt important to David even when they weren't particularly welcomed or appreciated by recipients. Felt like continuation of what Eli had started, like participating in small acts of recognition that might not change anything material but that at least resisted the invisibility that made homelessness even more psychologically devastating than material deprivation made it. He couldn't solve homelessness, his own circumstances remained marginal, his resources were limited, his capacity to help others was constrained by his need to maintain his own stability. But he could at least see people, could at least acknowledge their presence, could at least offer the kind of recognition that had mattered so much to him when he'd been the one sitting on bookstore steps. Eli, now 12 years old, had no knowledge of any of this. Continued with his life, school, activities, friendships, family, without awareness that brief interaction when he was 7 had created effects that were still rippling forward years later. Would probably never know, would never have occasion to learn what his simple smile had helped initiate, would never understand how small moment of unself-conscious kindness had mattered to person whose circumstances had made small moments feel large. The not knowing didn't diminish the significance. Didn't mean the interaction hadn't mattered just because Eli wasn't aware of its mattering. The effects existed independent of his awareness, continued to shape David's life and through David's changed behavior shaped how David interacted with others, created small network of consequences that extended beyond the original moment into future that was still being constructed by accumulated decisions that had become possible after that moment of being actually seen. David's life continued to be marginal, continued to involve struggles that people with more resources didn't face, continued to be characterized by forms of instability and vulnerability that were invisible to people whose circumstances provided more cushion against disruption. But it was his life, was life he was actively living rather than just enduring, was characterized by agency and participation rather than by passive acceptance of circumstances that felt unchangeable. And it had started, not in simple causal sense but in terms of what had created opening for change to begin, with 7-year-old child who'd done nothing more complicated or heroic than smile back at homeless man who'd smiled at him first. Who'd engaged in simple reciprocal social behavior that adults had learned to filter through too many layers of judgment and fear and social distance. Who treated David as person rather than as problem, even if only for 30 seconds, even if only because he was too young to know that some people weren't supposed to be acknowledged that way. The smile remained with David. Not as sentimentalized memory of magical moment, not as story he told frequently or that defined his understanding of his recovery, but as quiet anchoring knowledge that even brief moments of genuine human connection could matter, could create openings that seemed impossible before those moments occurred, could remind people who'd been made invisible that visibility was still possible if circumstances could shift in ways that allowed re-entry into social world that had previously excluded them. Sometimes the smallest kindness isn't meant to change the world. It's meant to remind someone that they're still in it. That they're still visible, still part of the social fabric they feel excluded from, still capable of normal human interactions that seem impossible when every day is characterized by being looked past or being looked at with discomfort and judgment. Eli's smile didn't solve David's homelessness, didn't address the systemic factors that create and perpetuate housing instability, didn't change anything material about his immediate circumstances. It just reminded him that being seen was still possible, that simple human acknowledgement could still occur, that the distance between his marginal position and something resembling normal social participation wasn't absolute or permanent. That reminder mattered. Created opening that hadn't existed before. Didn't guarantee anything. David's eventual stability required years of work and countless decisions and systemic supports and simple luck about avoiding further crises. But the opening was necessary even if it wasn't sufficient, was the beginning even if it wasn't the complete explanation. And it cost Eli nothing, didn't require heroic action or exceptional sacrifice, just required being willing to engage in simple reciprocal social behavior, being willing to smile back at someone who'd smiled at him first, being willing to treat homeless person as person rather than as category requiring protection from. We move through cities surrounded by people we've learned not to see. People whose circumstances or appearances trigger filtering mechanisms that make us look past them, that make us accelerate our walking pace when passing them, that make us clutch our possessions or our children closer when proximity requires acknowledging their presence. This filtering is protective in some ways. Cities are overwhelming environments. Attending to everyone you encounter would be exhausting. Some caution about strangers is reasonable given actual risks that exist in public space. But the filtering also creates invisibility that is itself a form of harm, that compounds the material difficulties of poverty or homelessness with psychological toll of being consistently unacknowledged, of being present but unregistered, of being treated as obstacle rather than as person. Small moments of acknowledgement can't solve these systemic problems. Can't house people, can't address the economic factors that create housing instability, can't change the institutional responses that often criminalize rather than support people experiencing homelessness. But they can at least resist the invisibility, can at least maintain recognition that people in marginal circumstances are still people, can at least create brief moments of normal human interaction that remind both parties that social connection is still possible across differences in circumstance and status. So notice people you've learned not to see. Make eye contact. Smile. Acknowledge presence. Small gestures that cost nothing, that don't solve anything material, but that at least resist the invisibility that makes difficult circumstances even more psychologically devastating than they already are materially. You won't know what effects these small acknowledgements create. Probably most will have no lasting impact, will be forgotten immediately by both parties, will be just momentary interactions that fade into the background noise of urban life. But occasionally they'll matter in ways you'll never know about, will create openings that become beginnings, will remind someone that they're still part of the world they feel excluded from. Be StoryWise.